Hello, I'm Ethan Higgins, and welcome to this special episode of the Spanish Civil War podcast. Joining me today is Liam Martin, a student of my alma mater, Hillsdale College. He recently finished his senior thesis on counterinsurgency strategy in the Spanish Civil War. I thought I would interview him about what drove him to this topic and ask a few questions about his thesis. First off, thank you for coming. I really appreciate it. And I know that the last semester of senior year can be quite busy, so just thanks again for lending me some of your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Ethan.
So, I read your thesis a few days ago, and before we start, let me just say that I think you've done an excellent job. This sort of writing is definitely something that I hope to emulate, and the level of research that you've put into this is astounding.
Thank you. It's took a bit of work, but you flatter me on the content.
So, I have a list of questions that I've prepared. Do you mind if I just start asking?
Go for it.
All right. So, first off, what was it that drew you to the Spanish Civil War, and what inspired you to pursue this particular thesis in it? I know that for myself, I I really kind of got driven towards this podcast by taking a one credit with one of the professors at Hillsdale, and just sort of from there, I kind of developed an ever growing interest as I read more and more on it. But I'm curious to hear from you what about this kind of appeals to you, and then yeah, what sort of drove you to pursue your thesis?
Yeah, so I've always kind of been, a lot of my major has focused on 20th century military history, especially from the standpoint of how did warfare change in regards to the political and technological innovations of the 20th century. And so I was kicking around a lot of these questions, and I went to Dr. Stewart, who I believe was the one who taught the class he took.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, and so I was talking to him about some of these ideas, and he's like, okay, so if you want to explore these ideas, here's a couple things you got to think about, right? You've got to look at, are there sources on this topic? And have enough people already written on it that it's not worth doing? And so that ruled out, the world wars in Vietnam pretty quickly. And, but he's like, Spanish Civil War, like not a lot of people have done some research on that. And I knew a little bit about the war, just, being a history buff or whatever. But I was like, yeah, that sounds interesting. And so as I started diving into it, I started really realizing how fascinating a topic it is. And that's kind of where my thesis grew out of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely it's very unique and kind of when you go at it from like the starting point of like really examining it in the interwar period, it starts to illuminate a lot of the various nuances. I think at least in that period too, since um, I need to finish, like I haven't gotten to this point in the podcast at the time of recording, but I have Franco's Volunteers on my shelf that I
Yeah.
hope to cite, and how like the opening of that book gets into like all the weird nuances of that, where you have people like Peter Kemp that will on the one hand be volunteering for Franco, and then like later on in the war they're fighting those same Italians at the Balkans.
Right.
That yeah, it's in a lot more flux than what people give it credit for.
Certainly true.
So with your thesis then, when I was talking with Stuart, yeah, I was pretty intrigued when he mentioned that you were going to argue that the Spanish Civil War was best viewed as a counterinsurgency carried out by Franco and the nationalist military establishment against the insurgent Popular Front forces, which is, yeah, definitely very intriguing because a lot of very conventional narratives of the war will consistently refer to the nationalists as like the rebels, as an insurgent force. But in your essay, you seem to sort of flip that on its head. Was there anything that like just sort of like did you read from a lot of these counterinsurgency thinkers before you got into this topic, and as you were learning about the Spanish Civil War, you saw parallels, or was it like or was it the opposite, where you were reading about the Spanish Civil War and then like you ran into these counterinsurgency thinkers and were like, oh, this can be actually applied pretty aptly?
Yeah. So the process of getting there was a little bit of both. Because I went into it and I was like, okay, obviously there's a lot of irregular warfare, guerrilla warfare, that sort of thing going on, and that's pretty commonly accepted about the Civil War. But so I decided to pick up some of the counterinsurgency theorists and read through them as I was working. And what I expected to come to the conclusion of was, well, both sides are controlling space and running counterinsurgency in their own territories.
Mm-hmm.
And as I read, I just realized that's not even true in the exactly. I mean, it is to some degree, but
Mm-hmm.
when you really look at it, I mean, so how these thinkers a lot of times are defining counterinsurgency, and to be clear, most of the thinkers really coming up with this terminology are decades later, so it's a
Yeah.
little anachronistic to apply. But the way they're thinking about it is an insurgency is when you have an irregular, non-state, non-governmental sort of actor rising up against a established, you know, in control government, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and the more and more I started to research it, especially coming across the work of Stanley Payne, started to realize this fits the Republicans a lot. Payne has an awesome book, one of the best on the war. We have a lot of good books on the war, actually, but the one I'm particularly thinking of is The Revolution in Spain.
Mm.
And in it, he kind of lays out how, look, these, Popular Front forces, they were not trying to preserve an existing democracy. These were revolutionary, anarchists and communists who were pushing for a radical change in the regime. And so that really
Mm-hmm.
sent me down the rabbit hole of realizing, like, oh, maybe much of the narrative that's presented about this war is just wrong.
Hmm. Yeah, I don't have I unfortunately don't have his Payne's the revolution in Spain, but I do have his the collapse of the Spanish Republic, and
Right.
it gets into it's the same author, so he's gonna get into the same sorts of things, maybe with like some different citations, but yeah, that's definitely sort of the conclusion that I've kind of drawn from it as well, and it actually kind of takes us very nicely then to my second official question, which is the first thing that I immediately noticed in your thesis is that um, you chose to date the start of the Civil War, or at least the beginnings of formulations of a counterinsurgency strategy to 1933. Which was immediately interesting since most conventional narratives place it at 1936 with Franco's pronouncement, and then like all of the uprisings and crazy developments that happen after that. And would you and I noticed that in my the collapse of the Spanish Republic, Stanley Payne puts in the subtitle 1933 to 1936, which uh, so what made you decide to choose 33 as opposed to 36, where because 36 is usually the pretty conventional one where we have at least like in the in most general circles is like the date of the Civil War. Why'd you
Right.
choose
That has
33?
to do
Yeah.
with the nature of counterinsurgencies and insurgencies in general, which is they exist in kind of this gray zone between open war and real peace. And so much
Mm,
of the early work of an insurgency happens before war is publicly declared. And
mm,
I'm sure at some point we can go into sort of more detail on that if you want. But the one, I guess the way I start it is like 33 is where the left in Spain decides that they're done using regular legal means and they are launching a revolution.
hmm. Yeah, that I mean, if one wanted to get really cynical, and I'm debating about doing this for when I eventually finally get to the establishment of the Republic, because at the time of this recording, I'm still just working on explaining the Primo de Rivera dictatorship. Um,
Right.
like it does seem like from the Republic's inception, there's not a lot of people that are, but or okay, a correction. There are actually a decent portion of like sincere Republicans that believe in fair play or whatnot, but to the extent that they have the political will to, maintain it, and to the extent that they actually possess a sufficient majority in like in the Republic, they're far more minimalized by the two opposing sides that really just see the Republic as a stepping stone to some other project. Whether on the left, that's, the eventual Marxist utopia, or on the right, in the case of like Seda, the creation of like a Catholic corporate state.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, the main thing that happens between establishment of the Second Republic in 1931 and then 1933 is that its legitimacy as a republic gets put to the test by having the opposition win, right?
Yeah.
So in 31, you have what you might call a center left or liberal government elected under Azana, who's, his goal is reform, right? That's what he calls it. You'll hear people call it the reformist biennial, is the 2 years of his rule. And the big push there was, right, like, we've won the election. Now we'll pass laws to put in these, land reforms and, give some home rule to Catalonia, right? Things like this, things that have been leftist talking points for a while, but they do it through legal means.
Yeah.
And a lot of Spanish people don't like that, right? The church doesn't like it, the landowning class doesn't like it, and the middle class doesn't like it.
Yeah.
And so what happens in 33 is that a center-right coalition gets elected.
Yeah.
And that's where it starts to come. This is why that's, I would say, the moment where things change. Because the left in 1933 decides that can't happen.
Yeah. Yeah. That's where you have
So,
that's the Asturias uprising, right?
yes, exactly. So in 33 and into 34, the left just rises up. They basically say it's only democracy when we win. We
Yeah.
are going to rise up and overthrow this illegitimate center-right government. And the military puts it down pretty hard. Over the course of 34, there are some pretty harsh repressions. Most of the ringleaders are rounded up. Quite a few are shot, but most are imprisoned. A few are sent into exile, things like that. And so it seems like a pretty crushing defeat for the left. But once that happens, though, the problem is that that seal's opened, right? There's no going back. The Republic has lost its legitimacy once one side says we are not allowed to lose elections.
And I mean, like, comparatively to I try to maintain a decent degree of neutrality on the podcast, but judging by from what I've also seen from Payne, like, yes, it's undeniable that, like, any uprising that's going to happen in the 20th century, like, there's a swift reprisal, but comparatively there seemed to have been at least like a pretty decent amount of just like letting it slide with a lot of some of the major ringleaders as well that would go on to be pretty major leaders in the Republic, in the years that followed, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, what you're not seeing is large scale, Stalin style purges. You're not seeing, some of the brutal repressions that would become typical of the 20th century on the, multiple sides.
Yeah.
It's essentially what a Spanish government would traditionally do in response to a rebellion, right?
Yeah, whether that would have been the Carlist wars of years before, or some of the
Exactly.
other respective regionalist ones. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So from the standpoint of the center right government, what it looks like is, pretty much a normal rebellion. They treat it like a normal rebellion. But the left doesn't see it that way, right? The left sees the center right coalition as fundamentally illegitimate. And that's why almost as soon as the left comes back into power in 36, they start just freeing all these prisoners illegally, right? Azana unilaterally uses presidential power to let people out of prison that were these rebels, brings people back from exile, right? Like, this is a big push on the left in the 36 elections. And that's much of what the trigger is for, the escalating violence and eventually Franco's declaration, right?
Yeah. Well, so in that context, yeah, it does make sense to sort of place it at 33, because, like, not only is that where, like, a lot of the left makes its bones, but if I remember correctly, wasn't Franco involved in, like, putting down the Asturian uprising? Or
He was. Most of the generals who would later become involved in the junta were involved in putting down the uprising. That's part of why, if I remember correctly, don't hold me on this, but I'm pretty sure that's part of why Franco ends up getting sent to North Africa, is to avoid some of the political scandal.
yeah, no, that makes sense.
But also, that's another one of the general's concerns. Once the left comes into power in 36, because one of the other left wing talking points is punishing the military leaders who led the crackdown.
Hmm.
Right? There's a
Yeah.
real push on the left to destroy or at least significantly weaken the Spanish military, and especially its pretty conservative officer corps.
Yeah. And this is something that, sorry to pull away from my official questions again,
Mhm.
but this is something that it does seem is fairly consistent with the Spanish military, at least prior to the Civil War, is that like they'll get called in to basically like clean up whatever sort of uprising is going on by the government, and then the government basically uses them to sort of get all their anger, get the the anger for crushing that uprising put onto the military, which causes then further resentment in the military class for basically being like, look, you told us to do this thing. We're soldiers. We're not. It's not
Yeah,
like, we're going to handle this with kid gloves, and then you go and
yeah.
blame any
This is a
excesses that
trend you
happen
see
on
in a lot
us.
of the early 20th century, because especially you see it in France and Spain in particular,
Hmm.
but in other places as well, where the military is and always has been a very conservative profession, right? It's usually a family business,
Hmm.
and it's largely allied with the church and the aristocracy, at least in loose ways.
Hmm.
Um, and I mean that's even now. I mean, like in America, right? I mean, you poll the average officer, they're going to be significantly more conservative than the general population.
Yeah.
Um, and so this is a trend, right? And so, but one of the problems that's happening in these new Republican states in the late 19th and early 20th century is they have to figure out what to do with this institution of the military because they need it to run their state, but it makes them uncomfortable and it's unpopular with it doesn't fit with the new democratic ideals that they're promoting,
Yeah.
right? Because the military can't be a democracy, and
Hmm.
that makes things, and especially when you have a tradition of an independent military more so than exists in say America,
Yeah, and
um,
especially in Spain.
especially in Spain, right? So it makes it very difficult for um, like the relations between these liberal republics and these very conservative military establishments. It's a problem that will go all the way through World War II.
Yeah.
Whether the Petain regime in France, right? A lot of these,
Yeah.
and earlier in the 20th century with like the Dreyfus affair, right? You're seeing a lot of these similar tensions play out.
Yeah. Yeah. So, um, I guess having exhausted that tangent, I'll move on to the third question, which kind of takes us away a little bit from direct Spanish history and more into sort of the theories on counterinsurgency. Um, could you give us a brief definition of the five stages of counterinsurgency and just maybe some of the theorists that you drew from for those definitions? I know some of the answers as will probably go a little bit beyond here, but I think that it'll help add some context for the audience for later discussions.
Yeah, so I'm going to answer them in those two questions in reverse because they make more sense to do it
Sure.
that way. So, um, my definitions of counterinsurgency are largely drawing on two main thinkers. Both of them are French guys with experience in Algeria
Hmm.
in the 1950s and 60s. The first one and the most well known is David Galula.
Hmm.
He's largely been the basis for conventional counterinsurgency. Well, sorry, that's a sort of a strange use of words, but the mainstream ideas of counterinsurgency largely
Hmm.
draw on Galula. I noted in the thesis that when you look at General Petraeus's counterinsurgency manual for the U.S. Army and Marine Corps, it cites Galula up upwards of several dozen times.
Hmm.
And it makes very clear he was one of the main influences for it. So he's kind of the leading voice of counterinsurgency, and so a lot of my thesis relies heavily on him. I also bring in another thinker who was a little more controversial, Roger Trincourt. He was an intelligence officer in during the Battle of Algiers in 1958,
Hmm.
and he kind of wrote about his experience there. And he does agree with Galula a lot, and so I don't really get into any disagreements between them very much in the thesis. But I kind of wanted to get a holistic view, so I kind of used both of them. And so then when I get to the stages, Glula and Trincor rank the stages a little bit differently. They use different terminology and so on. But I settled on 5, the definitions I did, because that seemed to be hitting the ideas of both of them. And so those stages, the first one is you get the formation of insurgent political parties, right, or other organizations. In
Hmm.
Spain, one of the big vehicles for that was actually trade unions and like
Mm,
labor unions.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, because
right. So in
you have
Catalonia, you
like
had a lot
yeah,
of anarchist
yep.
labor unions. In Madrid, you get some more socialist ones. And then you get the explicit political parties such as the Communist Party of Spain, right? Some of these other organizations, and these are organizations who explicitly deny the validity of the existing regime, right?
Hmm.
Their goal is regime change.
Yeah.
But they're minority factions. They may or may not participate in elections. Famously, for example, the anarchists do not, while they're aligned with the Popular Front, they do not participate in the 33 or 36 elections.
Mm.
On principle, they
Hmm.
oppose the idea of democratic elections.
Mm.
Um, but these parties all get formed, and they're pretty independent. Um, and then the second stage is where they form a united front. So that's where you get the Popular Front emerging. This is something that is very much pushed for by the Comintern in Moscow.
Hmm.
In fact, a group also called the Popular Front forms in the United States in the 1930s.
Hmm.
Um, and that's how the communists sort of brand themselves. But what it is essentially is the coalition of groups that don't necessarily agree with each other completely ideologically,
Hmm.
but share an opposition to the existing state of affairs and have
Hmm.
at least a similar broad sense of where things should go in the future.
Yeah, they all
Uh,
seem to agree on like a similar-ish end goal, if but
right, or at least
they
like
can't.
they all want an abolition of the existing Spanish society, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so
That's a
who
better way.
exactly wields the power in the new regime, right? Is it some sort of centralized state, or is it just the people directly, or is it
Is it
these, the
syndicates?
syndicalists?
Yeah.
Yeah. There are all sorts of debates about that, and there are debates about tactics and whatever, but they all broadly agree that the state of affairs now is bad, right? The state where you
Mm,
have private property and a church
mm,
and, a traditional state, even a republic,
hmm.
is insufficient. And so that's the second stage, and then the third stage is where they start taking more action, and it's terrorism, right? I mean,
Yeah.
uh, Trincor is very upfront about using that language. Glula also does use it, but he's a little more hesitant. But I mean, so that's where you start to see, um, after the 34 uprising, you just see large scale assassinations going on.
Yeah.
Usually, it is left wing groups targeting right wing political leaders, right? So whether phalangists or, I mean, ultimately you get to the assassination of the leader of the monarchist party right before that kicks off the war proper.
Yeah.
Um, but that's the last stage before you get into open war is just terrorism, right?
Yeah.
Bombings, church burnings, shootings. I mean, you get to the point where you're having gunfights in the streets between Falangists and communists,
Yeah.
throughout Madrid.
Yeah, and then like they'll have like they'll go and like bomb a phalangist newspaper and then just arrest the victims of it
Exactly.
afterward.
Yeah, right. And so this is one of the things that shows kind of, I think, why there's an uncertainty is once the left comes into power in 36, they don't make any attempt to control these leftist insurgent groups, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's it's
like you
it's a
mentioned,
war at that point. It's not even like the pretense of like, oh well, we'll put on like a show trial or whatever. It's like, no, we'll go. It's war.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, they're openly supporting political violence against their opponents, even though that political violence is being carried out by non-state actors who don't necessarily answer to the Republic, right? So it's
Yeah.
sort of a double-edged sword for the Republic because they see political advantage in letting these people do what they're doing. And they go to huge extents to help them, right? They free prisoners
Yeah.
illegally. They also, as you mentioned, Jose Antonio Primo de Rivera gets arrested for the crime of having his newspaper bombed.
Yeah.
Just really outrageous stuff. And
What?
then, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, well, I was just gonna say, like, I think that, yeah, I agree with all that. As a conclusion for, saying that the Popular Front does represent like an insurgency of a sort. What would you say though to the fact that going back to like the assassination of monarchist leader Carvel, yeah, I'm butchering his name.
I
Um,
probably did too, but that's at least I think
yeah,
the accepted anglicization.
yeah, but his assassination, wasn't that done by the assault guard? And I know that the assault guard was like largely kind of created to sort of create like a more ideologically loyal form of the civil
Yeah,
guard.
the
But
assault guard is a paramilitary unit. It's
oh,
not
okay. Oh, so it's
an
not fully.
official.
Oh,
No,
okay,
it's
that
not a
makes sense.
police force. It's not a military force. It is the paramilitary wing of the Popular Front.
Oh, yep. Yeah,
So
that
this
fits with the
is,
rest of it. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, and they are dedicated, and outspoken anti-fascists is the term they use,
Hmm.
and they're street fighters, right?
Yeah.
Um, they are, pretty much the equivalent of some of the Phalangist paramilitaries and the two of them are getting in fights all the time.
Ah.
And so in the string of assassinations that leads to the death of Calvo and the beginning of the war, it starts when there was an assassination. So I believe it was there was a assault guard killed in a fight or something, and so the or what is it? I don't know. Somehow it ended up that um, the assault guards end up firing on uh, a
Yeah.
funeral procession, and one of Primo de Rivera's relatives, a cousin or brother, I think, gets
Hmm.
killed, and so they respond by killing one of the captains of the assault guards, the
Hmm.
Phalanges do, and that's where it just spiraled, and eventually Cabo Sotelo is killed, despite the fact that he has really no connection to the Phalange.
Yeah.
He's not ideologically aligned with them necessarily. He's certainly not involved in any paramilitary activities. But as far as these so-called anti-fascist forces are concerned, everyone who isn't them is the enemy. And
Yeah.
so, Calvo Sotelo is a man of the right, and so he's guilty for the sins of all of them.
Yeah, and that's what pushes because like from what I've read, like a lot of the generals were kind of hesitant about even starting off a pronouncement, but it's that act of just brazen like because that happens, and then the government does absolutely nothing to persecute the assassination of this very pretty comparatively high profile individual. Like Sotelo was, if I remember correctly, like in the days of the monarchy, he was a pretty big minister. He ran a decently sized monarchist newspaper, and
Yeah, he was a major figure and the head of the second largest right-wing party
yeah,
in the Spanish government at the time, right behind Girobles of Seda.
yeah, and it's yeah, and he's just murdered, and there's nothing done to follow it up. Basically, kind of giving an implicit stamp of approval from the
Exactly. And
yeah.
that's where I think it's within 24, 48 hours that Franco makes his pronouncement and you see
Oh
the
wow.
uprising in North Africa.
I didn't know it was that close, but that does make sense.
Yeah, so yeah, I mean it was very clear to a lot of people in the military that the violence had gotten out of control.
Mhm.
Um, and the sort of junior officers, right, colonel rank on down, had been applying a lot of pressure on the generals to get involved for some time. And the generals have been saying, no, no, we don't want to do that. And they had finally gotten Franco to agree, I believe, just days before
Mhm.
the the murder, and that's the last straw. That's where he then goes publicly and says this is happening.
Yeah. All right. Sorry. We're going back to counterinsurgency
Yeah.
stages. Let's see. So we went off
Yeah,
the
so we have the third stage, which is terrorism, right?
yeah,
And
yeah,
that you see really culminating in these assassinations. But
yeah,
yeah, also the mass burning of churches, right?
yeah,
A lot of the atrocities that are associated with the war on the left actually happened before the war.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah,
And so,
all those like famous pictures of like the nuns getting dug up and like that. There's that one of that like militia that's like firing at a statue of Mary, I think. Like that.
yeah,
Um, I'll put it up on the WordPress at some point later on because it's one of those ones that like is
it's
constantly
striking.
cited. Yeah, it's very striking. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but once that happens, you then get into the next stage, which is outright guerrilla warfare, right? And
Mhm.
so that's really what you're seeing in the early stages of what is conventionally known as the war, right? So really, 1936 into 37 and the beginnings of 38, um, most of the fighting that's happening is not like there is no Republican military, right?
Mhm.
When the coup is launched, pretty much the entire officer corps goes with Franco, as do most of the most hardened sort of combat units, especially like North Africa, and almost half the military in Spain. A lot of the enlisted men are from working backgrounds and are more sympathetic to the unions and the Popular Front. So it's a
Yeah,
little more mixed on the
and
lower
that
levels.
yeah, and that might divide too based off of just locality alone. Like
Yes.
as much as this is a very ideological war, there are plenty of weird situations where you'll have like I was just reading about like this one like conservative Catalonian that did a bunch of propaganda for the monarchy, but then once when the war broke out, like he sided with the Republic because they were giving more concessions to Catalonia, and vice versa
Right.
for like Franco's brother who was like a really big anarchist. But then when the war broke out, he sided, sided with family instead of
Right. Yeah, I
ideology.
mean, as with every civil war, these things are kind of
Yeah.
complicated. But yeah, so Payne lays out the exact numbers, and I have a note in my thesis on them. I don't remember them off the top of my head, but the big thing to know is that like almost the entire upper echelons of the military and all the elite units that have been fighting in North Africa all go with the nationalists. So the what remains to the Republic in terms of professional soldiers, most of them are conscript with little to no experience, and they have essentially no officers over them. So
Hmm.
it's a completely useless fighting force. Um, so the fighting ends up being carried out by these militias, right? The assault guards is sort of the most regularized, right? Because it's a paramilitary unit. But you see all these trade unions and political parties raise their own militias. So
Hmm.
famously, Eric Blair, better known as George Orwell, he served in a Pelham militia, which they're accused of being Trotskyites, but they're essentially non-Stalinist revolutionary socialists.
Hmm.
Um, and they had their own militia, right? I mean, like these ideological distinctions. I mean, these are very localized militias that have essentially no structure. I mean, in Homage to Catalonia, he goes in real detail about these guys. They barely know how to use rifles. They None of them have any military experience. They don't really have a military hierarchy, right? They address each other as comrade. There's no real ranks exactly.
Hmm.
Um, these are irregular fighting units. And much of what happens in those early stages of the war is essentially the nationalist forces get bogged down in a bunch of guerrilla fighting with these militia groups. Um, Orwell has a quote where he said, basically, if the militias hadn't resisted Franco, he wouldn't have been resisted at all. There was no organized resistance from the Republic for the first several years of the war.
Yeah, and I mean like that's also I think kind of going into a bit of a tangent back onto like just history of Spain in general. That does seem to be a thing that makes the Spanish Civil War a little bit more distinct from other internal conflicts in Spain. Because usually, like, yeah, there have been civil wars in Spain. I covered briefly like the Carlist Wars and um like a few of uh like a couple of other uprisings. But this one was interesting though because like you had the typical sort of procedure of a pronouncement that happened and but instead of like the usual transfer of power to the military to hopefully then get handed back to a new more like competent civilian administration. You had, as you were talking about, like these militias sprouting up that were composed of everything from like sympathetic policemen to uh, just fully armed trade unions.
Right, exactly. Um, so yeah, that next stage is the guerrilla warfare stage, and it really is what I mean. It takes up all of Orwell's Homage to Catalonia. Um, he really documents closely the transition that happens, right? As there's the attempt to switch to the next phase, which I'll get to in a second. But as there's an attempt to switch, there's a real consolidation of power by what looks like the Republic, but has
Mm-hmm.
at this point fallen almost entirely into the hands of the Communist Party.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and yeah, that next stage is the conventional warfare stage, right? That's what, and a lot of people don't think of that as part of counterinsurgency.
Yeah.
Um, but it is, and Galula and Trincourt are both very clear that this is every counterinsurgency like eventually turns into this. And they were they had experience in Algeria, but also in Indochina, and so what they're thinking of is like Dien Bien Phu, right? In
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
50s, when you have these Vietnamese insurgents who build actually a conventional military and then just crush the French in open battle, right?
Yeah. Like
Um,
the stakes for losing are now equalized on both sides. It's no longer
exactly.
it's interesting though because like you sorry to take it off topic a little bit, but like, you brought up that these are pretty modern thinkers, but what they're effectively describing though, like I mean, you can go back. I mean, obviously, as everybody's really tempted to like draw comparisons to the American Revolution, which like obviously has a lot of guerrilla warfare in it. It's not. There's not really a turning point really hit until the Continental Congress is able to assemble an actual like professional army that is
Right.
then
Until you get
like
conventional victories at places like Saratoga and Yorktown,
yeah
the Americans are able to bleed out the British. But like sooner or later, and this is just kind of logically flows from the idea of a counterinsurgency and of an insurgency, right? Is you can't win an insurgency unless you become no longer the insurgent, unless you
yeah.
become a conventional power and actually have power.
And I think about
Um,
that. Yeah, it's interesting how apolitical this is too, because like that's something that like drawing more from like the left side too. I think Mao, from what I've read of like his doctrines on guerrilla warfare, gets into a lot as well.
Yeah, so
Um,
guys like Lula and Trincourt are reading Mao, and what's
yeah.
interesting is Mao writes his his on guerrilla warfare in 1937,
Oh wow.
right? So these are ideas that are being formulated by left wing thinkers mostly in
Yeah.
the 30s, and it's only in the 50s once they're really being applied in the colonies that you start to see Western more right wing governments trying to think about these problems.
Yeah.
Um, and they are looking at these left wing thinkers like Mao, and they're saying these guys have it right. You
Yeah.
know, so yeah, no, it's really apolitical. Although, well, apolitical in the sense that it works for either side, but it's
Yeah.
very political, obviously.
Yeah. The subject matter is very political, but the
Mhm.
application is fairly apolitical. Uh, but yeah, yeah, so last stage is then to full on conventional warfare, but that is at least as far as like it being an effective strategy for the Republic, where in your essay it seems like things start to fall apart a little bit because
Yes, this is where
yeah.
the left loses the war. Um, and so that gets into the question of foreign aid, right?
Hmm.
Trincourt in particular talks about how for an insurgency to succeed, it needs foreign support. Because one of the problems an insurgent has, right? They have all sorts of advantages. When you're fighting a guerrilla war, you have all sorts of advantages over the conventional force. But the disadvantage you have is you don't have stuff, right?
Yeah.
You don't have access, control of factories, military depots, like the sorts of things you need. And the left has this problem, right? The Franco's troops are they have the military, right? They have the regular equipment, and then they get access very quickly to Italian and German supplies. So they are the better supplied side throughout the war. And so one of the big problems the left has to try to figure out is how to change that.
Hmm.
And they get a little bit of support from Mexico, but Mexico's far away. They can't really send much.
Well,
They get a
Mexico's
little
part.
bit from
Sorry.
sorry.
Oh, I was
over
gonna say
there.
Mexico not only is far away, but it's also kind of recovering a little bit from its own tumultuous
It
period
is.
of
Right. Yeah, this is true.
internal
Um,
violence. But yeah, sorry, go on.
yeah, and the
I shouldn't.
Cristero Wars are really breaking out in Mexico around the same time,
Yeah.
in similar over similar sorts of questions. Um, and then France sends a little bit, but they are very hesitant to get involved. They're looking at Germany, right?
Yeah.
They have been thinking about war pretty nonstop for a while. Um, and they're just really hesitant to get heavily involved in Spain. So I believe there was one kind of funny anecdote where the French send a bunch of fighter planes to Spain, but they
Mhm.
remove not just the guns, but the gun mountings too.
Oh yeah, I think I remember when you included that. And
Yeah,
that
yeah.
was a
Like
big
I mean, so
chuckle.
the Republic gets these planes, and they're like, these are useless. Like it would be so like the price it would take to refit these with guns is just like we don't have that.
Yeah,
Um,
and then there's also the concern alone too of like this is yeah, it's calling itself a republic, but like France is at this point I know that it's under control of like a left-wing government, but like I can't imagine its right-wing factions like that still have any, amount of power as an opposition party being wholly okay with, giving guns and money to the
yeah,
Republicans.
I mean, obviously, a big part of the French consideration has to be they are in a similar situation to Spain, right?
Yeah.
They've got a military that's very hostile to the Republic. They have some of these sort of like right wing sort of analogs to the Falange going on in Action Française,
Mhm.
right? They've got a lot of the same issues, and they're worried about opening up a war with Germany sometime in the near future.
Yeah.
That's why they're building the Maginot Line and things like this.
Yep.
And so, yeah, there's just what the French left is not in a position of power by which to send resources to Spain,
Yeah.
at least in any significant numbers.
Yeah.
Um, and part of it is England is very strict on trying to push neutrality,
Yeah.
and France doesn't want to jeopardize its alliance with England. So that's something else to consider.
Yeah.
So when it comes down to it, the only real provider of equipment to the Republic is the Soviet Union, right? I mean, they repeatedly sign statements saying that they won't do it and statements of neutrality, but they're they're sending volunteers, but especially aircraft, guns, ammunition, supplies, right?
Mhm.
They essentially become the only access to these things that the Republic has.
Yeah. And kind of
And
going
what that
back. Yeah.
means is that they get a lot of leverage. And
Hmm.
suddenly the Moscow aligned communist parties can dictate terms a lot. Because the Soviet Union is not just wanting to support the Republic, right? They're not
Yeah.
interested in that. What they want is a tool of Moscow for Stalin's European plans.
Yeah.
Um, and so that doesn't really fit with traditional republic exactly, nor does it fit with the revolutionary sort of ideals of groups like the anarchists or Palm or any of
Or
those
P
groups, right?
or like PSOE or like any of the
Exactly,
non Soviet aligned ones. Yeah.
exactly. So what they end up doing is they basically funnel all the weapons to only communist groups,
Hmm.
um, and very quickly the communists gain a huge outsized influence. Right, they were never a very big part of the Popular Front, really, right? Like the
Yeah.
communists were maybe, I mean, behind the anarchists were by far the largest group in the grassroots or early on,
Yeah.
and then a lot of the various socialist factions that are, the non-Stalinist socialist factions are bigger as well. The communists are pretty small early on, but with this boost from Stalin, they really end up gaining a huge amount of control over the republic. I think Payne also points this out in the Spanish Revolution, but or the Revolution in Spain, sorry, but it's at one point something like 85 or 90% of all the officers in the new Republican Army, like the Popular
Hmm.
Army, are communists,
Yeah.
right? It's
And,
outrageous.
and I mean
So
like that, and that goes too with like the international brigades. Like, cause but when we were listing off, like the international support that the Republic could receive, and somebody might, point out like, oh, but what about the international brigades? That's pretty much just like another arm of Soviet policy at that point, though. Like, if
right,
you're if you're signing up for that, like you're probably a card-carrying Communist Party member in your own respective country because that's the only way that you would hear about this.
Exactly. Even Orwell talks about he like strongly considered doing that.
Yeah.
He was offered the opportunity, and then he doesn't really explain the reason. He just kind of ends up not doing it, and then it's during the war that he ends up souring on the Communist Party. But when
Mhm.
he goes, he is about 3 inches away from being a card-carrying member of the Communist Party.
Yeah. Which changes as you'll probably get into with
Exactly.
how things break down for.
Right. So what happens over the course of 37 and 38 is there's a big push by the communists and the Republican government to regularize the war fast.
Mhm.
Even though they're fighting a pretty effective guerrilla war, right? These militias they're holding their own like remarkably well.
Hmm.
Um, but that doesn't serve the interests of either the Republic, who's trying to, guys like Azana are desperately trying to regain any control of the situation at all. For basically 2 years, a lot of the left wing groups have just been ignoring Azana's power.
Mhm.
And so that's so oddly enough, the sort of like moderate liberal faction ends up coming into alliance with the Stalinists because
Hmm.
both of them want a centralized, leftist state.
Mhm.
Because from Russia's point of view, or the USSR, right, they're looking at the politics of this time, right, and Hitler's already come to power and is, pushing for, openly calling for conflict with communism and Lebensraum moving eastward.
Mhm.
Um,
And also it fits in with like Soviet revolutionary doctrine to an extent. Like, because a thing that I mean, like I know that some people might bristle at this, but like a thing that I think should always be remembered, even when looking at like non it's I know like that it's a very clearly secular movement, but they do the communists like in different like revolutionary groups, they do have their own eschatology and like and kind of orthodoxy, and it seems to me, at least from my reading, that like what Moscow believes is like the ideal pathway for revolution demands an eventually conventional force, which is obviously something that like an anarchist is going to disagree with.
right. Yeah. Lenin's big addition to Marxist doctrine is that the dictatorship of a proletariat is a actual like state,
Yeah,
right? That's not really clear in Marx that that's the case. But Lenin's very clear, like, no, we actually have to build a conventional government with a military and all these things in order to eventually that state will wither away and we'll get the perfect communist utopia. But
yeah, but for
guys
now,
like
like we
but
yeah
guys like the revolutionary socialists that Orwell's hanging out with, they want the revolution now, right?
yeah
They want all, and the anarchists do this too, right? They want all the means of production in the hands of the people, and they start doing it at the beginning of
yeah
the war. And the communists come in, and this is one of Orwell's concerns, right? The communists come in and say, no, roll that all back, right?
yeah
We're reprivatizing things. We're not, handing things over to the people. We need a state, and we need some sort of functioning economy.
hmm
And so there's this power struggle that happens as basically the communists and the republic start demanding that these militia groups join the people's army under communist leadership,
hmm
and the anarchists and the socialists don't want to.
hmm
And so you end up with, and Orwell describes this in detail, right? I mean, you end up with actual like shooting in Barcelona between the anarchists and socialist militias and the communist-backed Republican army.
hmm
Um, and eventually, and this really destabilizes the front in Catalonia. In Madrid, it's a quicker process,
hmm
but basically, the communists are intent on forcing the war to be a conventional civil war.
hmm
And the problem is, from the standpoint of counterinsurgency theory, Glue and Trincourt talk about this, right? Like, you don't want to move conventional until you've completely weakened your opponent. Because if
yeah
you do, you're throwing away the advantages you currently have,
yeah
right? Like, if you don't have as many supplies and as well trained troops and so on as your opponent, and you're fighting a conventional war, then you're just fighting a conventional war at a disadvantage. Whereas if you're
Hmm.
fighting a guerrilla war, you can actually make that into an advantage for the increased mobility and things like that.
Yeah.
Um, but that doesn't fit with the Soviet foreign policy for Spain. And so eventually, what happens over the course of that year or so is that by the end of it, the communists are in complete control. Most of these militias have been disbanded or um, incorporated into the People's Army.
Hmm.
And that's where the war shifts pretty quickly, in the grand scheme of things. When you compare it to like Vietnam or Algeria or something, the Spanish Civil War does switch pretty quickly into a conventional war.
Hmm.
And that I think is partly why it's often viewed just as a conventional war by
Hmm.
historians, um, because the communists push this, and
Hmm.
it's a disaster for the Republic.
Well,
Um, you know, yeah.
yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, like, I mean, they succeed in crushing these militias and
Hmm.
establishing their own power in 1938, and then within a year, the Republic is dead. Right, completely
Yeah.
wiped out. The Francoists just completely cleaned them up because
Hmm.
the nationalist troops are better trained, better led, better equipped. So even the slightly larger numbers of the Republic are just not enough. And the Republic is essentially, in the process of regularizing its forces, it's also lost a lot of its popular support. Right, a
Hmm.
lot of these, sort of anarchist groups, they just kind of go home. Right,
Hmm.
they're not willing to fight for a return to the Republic or even a return to a sort of Stalinist organized state. They want
Hmm.
the revolution now. And so once that gets taken away from them, there's no real like the Republic loses a lot of its grassroots. Like the Popular Front loses a lot of its grassroots appeal.
Yeah, and would you say too that like that's kind of pulling our attention to the other side of the war for a second? That's like yeah, obviously like kind of going into the war, the nationalists are going to have a big advantage by just having a professional military. But also, would you say that another big nationalist advantage is that you have somebody at the helm, or at least by the time that it's whittled down to just him, like Franco, who like is unlike a lot of these Republican leaders that are very bent on like their own particular ideology and policy in enacting that in the middle of wartime conditions. Franco, on the other hand, will say stuff like, "We must unite for the nation," and anybody from like a an Alfonsoist royalist, a Carlist, a Phalangist, a conservative Republican can all come together and be like, "Yeah, we agree on that," and they focus just on like the winning of the war first and their creation of whatever government's going to be left at the
Yeah.
end of this second.
No, I mean this is another big part of my argument because that plays it's a counter-insurgency, right? Like the nationalist
Hmm.
side is not defined by any concrete set of ideological beliefs. I mean, you list a lot of the groups there. I mean, but one of the big factions that people don't talk about was just, sometimes people call them Praetorians or whatever. There was a big faction of people, just military guys, who were just like, I just think it would be better if the military were in charge instead of civilians.
Yeah.
They're pretty non-ideological other than that. And that's a big part of the push, in the junior officer class for Franco to do what he does. As well as you have the Carlists and the Alphonsus, right? You have the actual Phalangists. And the actual Phalangists, right? I mean, oftentimes, like, they're the ones maybe most similar to what you could call a fascist group.
Hmm.
Um, they're very syndicalist, economically. They have, their multi-step plan to turn Spain into a modern country. Um, and they're often like Franco's often credited with being one because he eventually establishes a party called the Falange as his party, and he adopts more or less Primo de Rivera's platform. Jose Antonio Primo de Rivera, that is.
Hmm.
And but he really views the Falangist leadership with a lot of suspicion. Um,
Hmm.
so there are a couple anecdotes that show this. Like, I mean, the first is when Primo de Rivera is arrested, Franco makes no real, like, none of the generals make any attempt to negotiate for his release.
Hmm.
Once he's executed, they, of course, are more than willing to use him as a martyr figure. Um,
Hmm.
but, he, you know, in a lot of ways, guys like Primo de Rivera are a problem for Franco.
Yeah.
because they promote a specific ideological vision in the way that the left was doing. And he doesn't want that, right? It ties him down too much, and it interferes with the unity
it
of the
drives a
country.
wedge. Yeah.
Yeah, and the other thing is a lot of the phalangists are viewed by suspicion by a lot of the other right wing groups, right? Like
Yeah.
Seda is very, I mean, does not like them at all because Primo de Rivera was himself Catholic, but not. He didn't make it a big part of his platform, and he was certainly anti-clericalist.
Yeah.
And there's a big anti-clericalist streak that runs through the hardcore kind of Falange thought. Whereas Seda was saying we need to go back to an established church and things like that. So there was a lot of on the religious grounds there's suspicion. There was also a lot of suspicion on economic grounds because in a lot of ways what Primo de Rivera wanted economically was not totally different from what some of the syndicalist groups wanted on
Yeah.
the left. And so a lot of the generals thought that the Phalangists were basically a liability because they were crypto leftists.
Yeah.
Right? That was one of the concerns that were had. Um, and then the third thing that really showed the problem was the Phalangists were way more brutal.
Mm.
So most of the reprisals and the killings behind Nationalist Line that happened are from Phalangist paramilitary groups. And one
Mm.
of the big conflicts that existed there was Franco was pretty insistent. Like when people submit to us, we're trying to restore order, right? We're not trying to purge society.
Mm.
And so he tends to be a lot more lenient with people who surrender and cooperate with his regime. But the Phalangists want to basically execute anyone who's involved in left wing politics at all in
Mm.
the nationalist sphere. And Franco sees this as, this would actually undermine Franco's power,
Mm.
right? Because much of his appeal is, hey, I'm just trying to restore order. And if you have nationalist guys going around killing everyone who is ideologically different from them, that undermines that appeal.
Mm.
Um, and so and the left is doing that, right?
Mm.
Outside of Madrid and so on, they are going through and just anyone who's attached to any sort of vaguely conservative party or the Catholic Church or anything is just getting executed. I mean, they
Mm.
even at one point I remember reading they seize the endowments of Catholic orphans on the presupposition that a Catholic child will grow up to be a Catholic, and Catholics are inherently fascist. Therefore, Catholic orphans are fascists.
Yeah.
I mean,
Jeez.
insane
Yeah.
stuff. And so that's part of what's undermining the Republic's popular support. And Franco doesn't want to make the same mistake.
Mm.
And so there's a big tension that happens, between the Falangist leaders and Franco. They don't like him, and he doesn't like them.
Mm.
And ultimately, once he does come to power, and World War II breaks out, he allows volunteers to go fight in the war on the side of the Axis, but only on the Eastern Front. And he makes sure it's only volunteers, and he highly, highly encourages a lot of the Falangist leaders to join, and
Mm.
essentially ships these guys off to go die in Russia.
Yeah.
Right? Like there's a big purge of the Falangists after the war. Because Franco's not interested in their ideological program, what he's interested in is establishing order, and that means establishing his own power, whatever sort of ideological concessions need to be made along the way. Right? People try to frame Franco as a fascist a lot,
Mm.
but what you're really looking at is he's a pragmatist, right?
Yeah.
He
I
wants
think.
to ensure his own power and to prevent the the disorder that was going on before the war. The ideological stuff doesn't really matter, right? He kicks out eventually the Carlists, right? A lot of these
Yeah.
a lot of the more ideological factions end up getting purged later on,
Yeah.
um, because they cause problems, and so the nationalists maintain a much more united front throughout the war,
Mm.
because the ideologues never really are in control.
Mm.
They're there. Franco puts up with them, but they, you know, they're never the ones calling the shots. But on the side of the left, that's just not true. I mean, by the end, the communists are calling the shots, and from the beginning, you had a bunch of different groups calling the shots and working independently.
Mm.
And so that does, yeah, it creates a huge problem for them. And one of the problems is, right, like when you're an insurgent, your ideology is everything. So
Mm.
it makes it hard to play nice with others.
Thank you for answering those previous questions. I have two last ones before I'll wrap up the episode. Um, so uh, I still haven't, at the time of this recording, I still haven't gotten to this part in the war, but I think in especially the context of the broader essay, and as I'll continue on with the series, I'll eventually get into this in a bit more detail. But um, did the deaths of the two other generals in the kind of initial nationalist junta have a significant impact on nationalist policy, or would you say that it has a kind of continuity from Mola to Franco?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, I haven't studied super closely these sorts of things. There wasn't, at the center of my thesis. But my inclination would be to say, when you look at how this course of the war played out, the generals were largely kind of irrelevant to how things went. So Franco and many of the other generals actually were very reluctant to start the war. Franco was kind of the last one to get on board. But most of the impetus for the war was driven by the officers just below them, right? The colonel and lower ranked officers, um,
Mm,
because they were tended to be the most conservative overall. And throughout the war, I think you can see that all the generals were trying to manage a sort of complex coalition, and they weren't really calling the shots independently. So I really think that, you know, whether or not there, I mean, people can debate whether how much continuity there was between Mola or Franco, but they ultimately were reacting to the same pressures, and I think their policies would have ended up pretty much the same either way.
mm. Would you say that a reason for why, like, you have a lot of more mid-range officers initiating the attempted pronunciamento is like because they kind of they've gained enough in their station to where they're comfortable with their rank, but they also have like enough to lose to where they're more than willing to sort of fight for it in the face of this kind of new government that's being set up that's trying to
Yeah,
purge ideological enemies and such because like yeah, I can imagine that if you're a general you're kind of close to retirement and like yeah there might be some stuff that's like unpleasant, but if you're important enough they're not going to go immediately out of their way to purge you without risking like immense public backlash like political backlash. But then yeah, and then if you're in the lower ranks it's kind of in a different thing, so it's kind of that middle sweet spot that might inspire more for lack of a better term, like, and ironically enough, because we're talking about conservative ideals, like revolutionary thinking.
yeah, no, I think that's almost certainly true in terms of these are the people who have something to lose but don't have anything to fall back on, right? The
Mm,
generals are
yeah.
powerful enough, connected enough. If worse came to worse, they could probably flee the country. Your
Mm,
average captain, say, probably doesn't have the resources to flee the country, and it would mean absolute ruin for them if
mm,
they did.
yeah.
But unlike an enlisted soldier, for example, they are part of this aristocratic system, and their station in society depends on the continuation of the army and their place in the army. So
And existing institutions, yeah.
exactly. Also, most of them came from upper middle class or lower aristocratic families, who tended
Mm,
to again be very conservative for much of the same reasons, right? Something to lose, but
mm,
no real, not the same level of influence and connections that the top tier of society would have. And I
mm.
think you see this trend broadly with sort of right wing movements in the 20th century that they're largely driven by the people who have something, but not so much that they're immune from the anxiety of losing what they have.
Yeah, then I guess that the last one, and this kind of ties into just the overall theme of the thesis, but it was a thing that I noticed and a thing that like I've picked up on once what I took when I initially kind of got academically interested in the Spanish Civil War, and it becomes more obvious when you just start to examine the historiography of the conflict as a whole. But would you say that the national like while the Republicans certainly excelled at distributing international propaganda, because I think like we have Picasso's painting of Guernica and Hemingway and just dozens and dozens of other works that basically managed to paint their intense ideological struggle in a more acceptable to the rest of like Western liberal audiences as a democratic struggle. Uh, that while they excelled in this international propaganda, that the nationalists excelled in internal propaganda. Because you mentioned that on like page 33, I think, of the essay, that they the nationalists worked hard to kind of accentuate Republican atrocities and yeah, but could you elaborate like a little bit more on that, I guess? Sorry.
Yeah, well, I think one thing to understand the propaganda war is the sort of broader international systems that both sides were part of, right? So for the Popular Front, they were tapping into a massive international communist propaganda machine.
Mm,
To the point where, you think of at the time in the 30s, I mean, this is only a few decades before, the Alger Hiss trial and some of
mm,
McCarthy's allegations and so on would show like the deep level of Soviet infiltration in the American government.
mm,
But it was just as true in media. I mean, broadly speaking, there were apologists for the Soviets embedded all over in media and politics all throughout the Western world.
mm,
Um, because communism is an internationalist movement.
mm,
And so, even for example, in America, there was a brief moment, kind of prior to the rise of FDR, where a group of the American Communist Party started working with liberals in America, and they called themselves the Popular Front.
yeah.
This is a trend internationally. So they have the communist network that they're participating in. And Franco and his side, their international network is largely the Catholic Church.
Mm,
You can see when you go through the sources of the people who came to fight for Franco,
yeah.
they there were Catholics from England, America, right, places that were seen as broadly pro-republic,
Mm-hmm.
but Catholics showed up to fight because it was often shown as a crusade against communism,
Yeah.
in defense of the church.
Mm-hmm.
And so, what part of I think the reason why that legacy has been kind of forgotten is because so much of the conservative narrative was discredited after World War II
Mm,
in the eyes of the public. But at the time, there was a very strong these were two very strong opposed machines of sort of international ideas and political allegiance. And the fact is, within Spain, you had a much stronger Catholic presence than you had a communist one.
mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
Spain doesn't have a large urban proletariat at the time.
Mm,
You don't have you know, the widespread involvement of communist ideas the way you do in, say, Russia or even Germany at the time.
mm-hmm.
But you do have a very strong Catholic presence, especially in the rural areas.
Mm-hmm. And that I guess ties back to as well that I mean obviously like it's pretty much universal among almost all groups in the Popular Front that they're going to have some varying levels of anti-clericalist thinking, but it kind of reminds me about what you were talking about earlier, though, that a lot of these more grassroots, sometimes more like anarchistic movements, especially in like the Basque Country, were generally a bit more successful at like hearts and minds to an extent,
Exactly.
and that might be very well because like, well, definitely still hostile. Like I remember reading like there's weird accounts of like like interviewing like an average like Basque Republican volunteer that still like has a crucifix in their house while
Yeah. The
like
Basques are a really interesting exception to a lot of the rules of the war because it was a still very Catholic region and Republican, but that's because then you're starting to get into sort of nationalist and separatist
yeah because the
movement. It's sort of different than what you're seeing in Madrid or even Catalonia to some degree.
yeah yeah
Like even in Catalonia, where it is a separatist movement, you still do have a strong ideological component.
hmm
But in the Basque Country, that's just not as present.
yeah well let me see.
Definitely highlights some of the nuances that were going on.
Oh yeah, I think it's interesting then that too then that you mentioned that yeah definitely after like World War II kicks off. There's obviously Franco's not going to look, in too much of a good light to many of the allies, and especially not the Russians who were indirectly fighting him. But
Yeah.
um, like it is interesting though that even though that like we going into the Cold War then as you mentioned before, Franco places his cards well enough that he's able to ingratiate himself into this sort of new anti-communist alliance in
Mhm.
the fall of the Third Reich and such. Um, that this narrative around Spain though still very much so persists, and even persists among uh, in in Western countries among people that otherwise if they wouldn't might not outright support the nationalists, but would definitely if they knew more about the Republicans would have not taken as strong of stances, because it definitely does. It's interesting to me just how much of the public square Republican propaganda dominated, which is a very kind of stark contrast, I guess, to how things were handled domestically, where
Mhm.
um, either for ideological reasons or just simple pragmatic reasons of the nationalists controlling food, they did not command the optics as much.
Yeah. Well, and I think a big part of that is retroactive because the way the war is overwhelmingly viewed now is as the sort of prelude to World War II.
Hmm.
Right. If anyone knows anything about the Spanish Civil War, it was the testing ground of the Luftwaffe and the Italian war machine.
Hmm.
Right. Like that's how it's presented. And so there's a sort of natural tendency, I think, to then paint, okay, well, the nationalists then are Nazis and the Republicans, yeah, they're maybe rough around the edges, but they're our guys, they're our allies.
Hmm.
But in reality, it's a different conflict. And while it had implications for this sort of broader European-wide conflict, and why people certainly had vested interests in it, the local situation in Spain was just totally different.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm kind of I'm reminded of an anecdote from Mine War of Trouble, where Peter Kemp, who was a British volunteer for the Nationalists, one of the, I believe either, I'm pretty sure it was Spanish, the Spanish Legion at that time that he was with. One of the legionnaires told him well, we like the help that we have received from Italy and Germany. He's like, I'm pretty sure that both sides would agree that it would be better if this just remained a Spanish conflict.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a funny anecdote about Franco when he actually met Hitler,
Oh.
and he was notoriously so insufferable to Hitler that Hitler later recorded, he said, "I would rather have all my teeth pulled than ever speak to Franco again."
Oh geez, I didn't know that. I knew that there was a lot more complexity to that relationship. That one especially is, I haven't heard that one, but that's great.
Yeah, yeah. Franco, he got along better with Mussolini, but even then it was a rocky relationship.
Yeah,
But there was not a lot of love lost between the Germans and the Spanish.
yeah. Well, I think that pretty much. Let me go and just double check if there's anything in particular that I've really missed. Um, I think that just about wraps up everything that I talked about. Thank you again so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. This
Yeah, absolutely.
is
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, this is really great content. I love just a chance to discuss this in more detail. Um, yeah, thanks again for coming on.
Yeah, absolutely.